Hello, Biblical Civilians. In this video, I am going to introduce you to three different models of covenant, models of different ways to understand the term Brit as it appears in Torah and beyond in Tanakh. Within the context of our course, we are kind of creating a kaleidoscope within a kaleidoscope. This class is about thinking about the people of Israel as being defined by being in a brit or a covenant with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, which is one model of how the people of Israel are constructed in Torah and beyond. At the same time, when we're thinking about what it means for Israel to be the people of a brit, or to be defined by brit, there are different ways of understanding what that means, and that's the subject of this video. So as we talked about in the prior class, or in the prior two classes, that the story of the Exodus, probably in its earliest form, likely existed without having the covenant smack dab in the middle of it. We talked about how the core mythic narrative was probably we were slaves in Egypt and God freed us and brought us into the land. So the story was one of subjugation in Egypt, miraculous freedom by God, which resulted in the entry and ultimately control over the Promised Land. However, as we know as readers of Torah, at some point in Israel's history, the covenant idea, the idea that Israel and Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh are engaged in a relationship of brit, was integrated into the story, and in fact, in the final form of Torah, becomes its climax. So there the story changes and becomes that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh brought Israel out of Egypt for the purpose of making them God's subjects. So we get redeemed from subjugation to Pharaoh, which is bad subjugation, and at Sinai enter into subjugation to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, which the whole Torah is trying to convince us is a beneficial form of subjugation. And that subjugation then becomes the kind of foundational agreement that leads to the ultimately the entrance and control over the land. As we talked about in class, it's likely that this covenant idea would have emerged during a period when Israel was a monarchy in the orbit of a larger empire. Because as I'll talk about in a minute, this whole covenantal idea probably arises out of the political realities of empire. So we're talking likely about the 8th to the 6th centuries. So what does brit mean? It appears a lot in Torah and Tanakh, and like most words, has a range of meaning. At core, it is a compact or a binding agreement. It usually or always involves obligation and commitment. Sometimes that goes both ways. Sometimes that goes only one way. It can be an elected, or it's defined by one scholar as an elected relationship of obligation established under divine sanction, suggesting that one thing that Brits have in common is that in some way there is a deity involved, either as a party or an authorizer or a guarantor of the arrangement. And then finally, another definition, a bilateral agreement involving specific obligations and loyalty to the covenant partner, whose goal is to effect shalom between the two parties. So that this is here explicitly a bilateral agreement. Both sides have obligations to each other. Both sides are expected to express loyalty to each other, although as we'll talk about, in one case that is exclusive loyalty, not necessarily in the other, and that the goal is to effect shalom, is to effect a wholeness and stability between the two parties. So those are just three definitions, or four, I guess, definitions or partial definitions of what brit may mean in the context of Tanakh. So where we see it specifically, what does the word brit describe in Tanakh? A lot of things. It can be a personal pledge between friends. David and Jonathan identify their relationship as a brit. It can be a binding agreement to carry out a plan. It's used to kind of bind the parties who agree that they are going to depose a Judean queen. It can define a range of political relationships between kings, between nations, between an empire and a vassal state, between a monarch and a subject, and I encourage you to pause your video here and just take a look at the text cited so you get a sense of those usages. But as you know, most importantly and most significantly in Tanakh, it's used to describe a relationship between Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and Israel. Because the covenant between Israel and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is so central in Tanakh, it has received a lot of scholarly attention. Many scholars have argued that the idea of Brit as a relationship between a God and his people, as it is presented in Torah and in Tanakh, was likely an innovation of ancient Israel, ancient Judea worshippers of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And that this was a religious innovation. In traditional Israelite religion, the relationship between the clan and its gods was one of mutual care, but there wouldn't have been a fixed set of stipulations or conditions. And if you look at Genesis 28:10 through 22, that gives you a good example. This is the scene where Yaakov is asleep on his way back to Padan Aram, and he has the famous dream of the ladder reaching up to heaven, and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh appears to him and says, I am Adonai, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying I will assign to you and your offspring. Your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and the south. All the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and your descendants. Remember, I am with you, and I will protect you, and go wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. So, and then a little while later, in verse 20, Jacob says, if God remains with me, if God protects me on the journey that I am making and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return to my father's house, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh will be my God, and this stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's abode, and of all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. So this is, even though, as we'll talk about in a second, there's something a little unique about this scene because Yaakov is apparently taking on a new god of the clan. What you can see there is that there's a relationship of mutual care here, mutual attention. God makes certain promises, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh makes certain promises, and Yaakov promises in return that if they become related as clan and patron god, Yaakov will give tithes to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. What's different, as I said, with this scene than with kind of traditional clan gods, is that usually the relationship between a clan and its god is in place from the beginning. It's envisioned as more of a familial relationship that you're born into than a political relationship that you enter into. So that's at the level of the clan. In royal and national religions, the king is in close relationship with the god and is supposed to follow the god's will, but that relationship doesn't extend to the nation. And we see an example of that in 2 Samuel 7. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 8, the prophet Nathan says to David, quoting God, further, say this to my servant David. Thus said the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture from following the flock to be the ruler of my people Israel, and I have been with you wherever you went, and I have cut down all your enemies before you. Moreover, I will give you great renown like that of the greatest man on earth. I will establish a home for my people Israel, and will plant them firm, so that they shall dwell secure and shall tremble no more, etc., etc. And then in the next verse, the Lord declares to you that he, Adonai, will establish a house for you. When your days are done and you lie with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own issue, and I will establish his kingship. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. So what we're seeing here is a pretty common adoption formula where the deity adopts the king, usually the founding king of the dynasty to whom that deity is going to be related. So here, and in what follows, we learn that the kings of the dynasty are expected to follow God's will, so that Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh has chosen David in his line. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh has adopted David as a son, has pledged protection and success as long as David follows the rules. So in the next verse, it says, when he does wrong, I will chastise him with the rod of men and the affliction of mortals, but I will never withdraw my favor from him as I withdrew it from Saul, whom I removed to make room for you. Your house and your kingship shall be ever secure before you. Your throne shall be established forever. So while this is a promise of an eternal dynasty for David, you have that verse snuck in there that the Davidic kings will be expected to follow Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh's will, and if they don't, there will be punishment within the context of that eternal promise. So those are, if you were living in the 8th century, kind of what you would expect about kinds of relationships between groups and their gods. The clan god in place from the beginning, familial, paternal, a sense of mutual care, but not necessarily mutual stipulation. Not necessarily kind of conditions that the people have to follow. If you were thinking nationally, you would expect that the main relationship is between God and the king, and obviously that's going to have implications for the people, but they are not kind of partners in the Brit relationship. In the covenant between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Israel, as it's expressed in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and beyond, there are some innovative pieces. First, the relationship is very clearly between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and the people, not Moshe, not Joshua, not the king. They have roles in it, but the primary covenant partners are Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and the people. The covenant is voluntary, and it comes into being at a particular point in the people's mythic history. So unlike clan gods who have been there from the beginning, except in the case that I showed you, and we can talk about why that is, the people of Israel enter into covenant with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh after they have been brought out of Egypt. And we'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about the covenantal theology. It makes Israel's future contingent on their covenantal behavior. As you know from being readers of Torah, over and over and over again, we're told that if Israel obeys the terms of the covenant, all will go well, and if not, things will go badly. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there have been different ways of, or different hypotheses about what the model or models for this vision of the Brit between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Israel is. The three we're going to talk about today are that it's modeled on suzerain vassal treaties, the Neo-Assyrian Ade treaties, instructions to a subordinate, earlier Hittite treaties, I don't know how you say this word, Ishuel maybe, or that it's modeled on documents that describe the disposition of temple rights. So, suzerain vassal treaties. This hypothesis was originally articulated by George Mendenhall in the 1950s and became highly influential in biblical scholarship. Mendenhall argued that the Brit between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Israel is modeled after treaties between a suzerain, a powerful king, and a vassal king, a kind of under king. This was a very common arrangement in the ancient Near East, and suzerain vassal treaty was a common genre. There is one model in Hittite treaties from the 15th to the 14th centuries, and then another, this Ade model, in Neo-Assyrian treaties from the 7th century. The structure of the treaties was as follows. It began with a preamble that identified the suzerain. So, I am Elsie, Emperor of North America. It then gave a historical prologue. It talked about why the vassal king was in a position to join in this treaty, or was, had to join in this treaty with the suzerain. So that might be oh, actually, we'll do it this way. I, Elsie, Emperor of the Mid-Atlantic States, talking to you, New York. When Canada tried to come and take you over, I was there and I protected you and I warded them off. And that is why, because I showed this great act of protection for you, that is why you should enter into this treaty for me. That'll be followed by stipulations. What is it that the two sides are obligated to? Very typically, that would include, on the part of the vassal, loyalty, taxes, other resources, including human resources that subjects would need to participate in kind of building projects and also serve in the army. After the stipulations, and that the suzerain was responsible for ongoing protection of the vassal. The next part of the treaty says where the treaty is going to be kept in case anybody had to check and see, refresh their memories about what the impetus or the terms of these treaties were. There were witnesses. Usually these were the gods of the two nations. And then at the end there were curses and blessings that delineated what would happen if usually the vassal, disobeyed the treaty. Those would be the curses, and the blessings would be what happened if they obeyed the treaty. Biblical scholars since the 1950s have said you feel echoes of this understanding of treaty all over Torah. And as you read in the Taggart-Cohen, there have been debates about, is there a place where the whole treaty is, where all of them are present? What happens if we only have 6 out of 7? Does it still count? I don't think we need to go into that level of detail. What I want you to notice are the ways that this model of treaty very well may be informing the breed between God and Israel. So Exodus 19 is one place where there are echoes. Moshe went up to God, and Adonai called him from the mountains, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me." Historical prologue. "Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel." Stipulations. Moses came down and summoned the elders of the people and put before them all the Lord had commanded, and the people answered as one, saying, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." So that's the kind of signing on. Another form of preamble, historical prologue, in Exodus 19 to 24, the covenant code starts out, "I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage." Historical prologue. The 10 Commandments in the covenant code are the stipulations. And then in Exodus 24, you see the deposition on the tablets and the recital. And you can pause your video here and read that text if you're not familiar with it. Again, you get a lot of echoes in Deuteronomy. You get the historical prologue in chapters 1 through 3. The Deuteronomic Law Code in 12 through 26 is in the place where we would expect stipulations. Deuteronomy 27, 1 through 8 is a narration of the deposition, or instructions for the deposition. Moshe and the elders of Israel charged the people, saying, "Observe all the instruction that I enjoin upon you this day. As soon as you have crossed the Jordan into the land that Adonai your God is giving you, you will set up large stones, coat them with plaster, and inscribe upon them all the words of this teaching. When you cross over to enter the land that your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you, upon crossing the Jordan you shall set up these stones, about which I charge you this day, on Mount Ebal, and coat them with plaster. There too you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones," etc., etc. And then the last verse, "And on these stones you shall inscribe every word of this teaching most distinctly." So these stones that the Israelites are supposed to set up are the deposition. They're the place where the treaty is preserved. And then finally, at the very end of Deuteronomy, we get witnessing, where in the blessings and curses in Deuteronomy 28 through 29, and then Deuteronomy 32, the beginning of the Song of Moses, Moses says, "Give ear, O heavens, let me speak. Let the earth hear the words I utter." These are pretty classic witness formulae, and here the heavens and earth are being called on to witness, because in Deuteronomy it would not be appropriate to have other gods being witnessing this treaty. So this first model, the model of the suzerain vassal treaty, is one way of thinking about what inspired or what lay behind the vision of the breach between God and Israel. In this case, modeled on the treaty of a big king and a little king, following the formula of historical prologue, stipulations, deposition, witnesses, blessings, and curses. So the question that I want you to think about and that we'll talk about in class is, what are we saying about the relationship between Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and Israel when we compare it to a treaty between a big king and a vassal king? So what does it mean to think of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh as a big king and Israel as a vassal king? And to understand the relationship between them in these terms. And especially since we're thinking about the construction of Israel as a covenant people, to think about Israel as being defined by their role as kind of vassal king in this relationship. The next model I want to talk about is the one that Tecker Cohen talks about in her article, which is the Hittite Ishiul. So Tecker Cohen, contemporary scholar, is interested in kind of a broader set of political relationships that are that were common in Hittite legal documents, and this is the Ishiul. I trust everything she says. I don't speak Hittite. She says it's derived from the word meaning to tie or bind. It's often translated as obligation, duty, regulation, or treaty, and it governed a whole kind of a wide set of relationships. It governed the relationship between a big king and a vassal, and it also governed all sorts of internal relationships of subordination and hierarchy that she argues in some way grow out of the initial arrangement between the suzerain and the vassal. She says that there are two types. There's the treaty type, which is between the kings, and then the instruction type, which is between, somebody in charge and internal subjects or employees. According to Tecker Cohen, both types of Ishiul included three main parts. The first is the recognition of the king's status. And if we're talking about the treaty type, actually in both of these types, there's a theological component here. It assumes, or often states explicitly, that the king is in some way working as a representative of the deity. She notes in the article that adoption formulae are very common. The king is understood to be the son of the god and is kind of the god's the administrator of the god's kingdom on earth. And the subjects in the treaty accept the king's authority over them. These documents often detail the obligations of the subjects. This is a far more detailed part in the instruction version, but also present in the treaty version, and also includes an oath before the gods. So, like the Ade treaties, it opens with an explanation of the relationship between the powerful party and the subordinate. It's written in the written text. In the treaties, it often involves a grant of land, and in the treaties is often conducted through a patriarch or religious political leader. They include instructions for the subordinate to follow, and as I said, this is particularly central to the instructions text, and also include threats for failure to comply. Couple of things that differentiate this from those Ade treaties. First is the frequency of a grant of land. And second, that she notes, is the role of the patriarch or the religious political leader. One of the things about thinking about Brit as being exclusively between God and Israel is you have to do a little photoshopping to get rid of Moshe and Yehoshua there. And in this model, there is often a mediating figure who's mediating the relationship, even between the suzerain and the vassal, or understanding the vassal as in some way mediating a relationship of obligation between the suzerain and the vassal's people. Tagar Cohen sees a lot of echoes of this in the priestly code, and you can look at those texts in our article on page 32 and 33. Oops, back up a sec. What's the other thing that's different about her Ishuel model is that whereas the suzerain-vassal treaty only refers to, obviously, relationships between suzerains and vassals, the Ishuel model in its instruction piece is much more internal, and could dictate the role of priests in the cultic system, or military officials, or soldiers within the military structure, or even household staff in the palace. And the reason why these are bound to, are kind of part of the same conversation as those larger treaties, is that just as the high king is administering the kingdom of the god, so too that vassal king and those people under him are kind of, it's like nesting Russian dolls. They are serving as their superior's representative. So if you imagine a treaty between a suzerain and a vassal king, where the suzerain is the representative of the gods, administering the empire on behalf of the gods, he is entering into a relationship with the vassal king, who's then administering his territory on behalf of that suzerain who's acting on behalf of the gods. And in order to administer that territory, he needs to give instructions, for instance, to the heads of the military, who are then going to manage the soldiers all in that line of on behalf of, till we get up to the gods. So the kind of job description of a palace cook might take the form of an Ishuel contract, and rather than focusing on kind of the larger terms of the covenant, would focus on the particular instructions that that person needs to follow out to play their role in this larger covenantal system. So, whoops. Flip 2 slides. Oh, went too far. Here we go. So the second question we're going to talk about is, what are we saying if we say that the relationship between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Israel is like that, not necessarily between the suzerain king and the vassal, but between a king or other powerful person and any form of subordinate in their employee, household subordinate. Is that different from the suzerain-vassal treaty? And if so, how? The third model that we're going to look at is called the disposition of temple rights. And I'm drawing this part of the lecture from the scholarship of a scholar named Jan Houston. He was found guilty of breaches of sexual ethics, so I no longer assign his work, but it would, I think it would be theft of intellectual property to present this without letting you know where I got it from. So that's how I'm navigating this particular situation. He argues that especially in the priestly sources in the Holiness Code, that the Brit is modeled on a kind of document called a disposition of temple rights. This was a very common relationship in ancient Swana, and what it articulated, or what it meant, was that inhabitants of a city or region are considered divine property and can't be sold to a human. The area to which this applied would be a well-delineated territory that belonged to the gods. It might be a temple, or a temple compound, or a temple city. And those, unlike the other territory in the kingdom or the area, was understood very specifically to be the property of the deity. Because it was the property of the deity, all impurity and all injustice were to be banished from the territory, both kind of material or physical impurity as well as the moral impurity represented by injustice were anathema to the god, couldn't be in that god's particular territory, so were to be banished. The divine presence in the sanctuary guarantees the safety of the territory. So the idea is that this territory has a higher chance of remaining safe and stable because the deity in some way dwells there in the temple. However, that is not necessarily a permanent relationship. If the gods get mad, they might leave because if they feel that their territory is not being kept free of impurity and injustice. If there are other forms of transgression of the relationship with the god could get angry and could leave the temple and the territory, which would leave the territory unprotected and therefore subject to conquest or destruction. So this should be familiar by now. The last question to ponder is, what are we saying if we say the relationship between Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Israel is like that between a god and its sacred territory or people? How does this imagining of Brit, which is much more theological, much less political, is grounded in kind of already religious structures, how does it change our understanding of who the people Israel is if they and their relationship with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh are modeled on this kind of relationship? With that, I look forward to seeing you in class. What we're going to do is address the questions to ponder and explore some scholarly hypotheses regarding the subversive nature of the biblical Brit. How does this idea function within the kind of geopolitical situation of Israel or Judah at various times in their history? So I look forward to seeing you soon.